The geopolitical context has significantly changed. You mentioned Germany, you mentioned the US. There's a lot of concerns generally on the rule of law in Brussels. There's a lot of pressure in terms of shifting alliances geopolitically. And so digital policy has sort of been dragged into the geopolitical moment.
For us, it's sometimes difficult to see that it took so long for people to realize what are the problems, what should be done, which I could summarize: Europe, please get your act together on digital.
This is Chloe Teevan, and this is Europolis, the Global Europe podcast. Today we start by looking at European digital policy, and I'm joined by my colleague Gautam Kamath, who's a brilliant expert working with us on digital policy and one of the co-authors of our recent report From EuroStack to EuroStack, Reconciling Approaches to Sovereign Digital Infrastructure. Later on, we will have a short interview that Gautam did with Kai Zenner, who is an advisor to Axel Voss at the European Parliament, and a member of the European People's Party, which is, of course, the leading party in the European Parliament and the party of Ursula von der Leyen. And so, Gautam, you've been based in Brussels for a number of years, really are a creature of the Brussels bubble, one might say. How do you see the digital policy environment changing at the moment? What are some of the big things that are happening, and how do you see these progressing in the coming months?
This is a very important moment for the Brussels bubble because there's a lot of pressure in terms of shifting alliances geopolitically. Two things really stand out given the geopolitical moment that we're in. One is this fear of being left behind economically, or what we are calling in Brussels competitiveness. The second sort of new thing, if you will, is this focus on security. They're concerned about which vendors, which companies are in our digital world, in our platforms, in our infrastructure, and so on. Finally, I think there is, based on the geopolitical moment that we're in, we're also looking at new opportunities with partnerships, with forming new partnerships with countries like India, like Japan, South Korea, Brazil. So all in all, I think it's a very busy time in Brussels. It's going to be a very busy next 3 or 4 or 5 years.
This week you spoke to Kai Zenner. Can you tell us a little bit more about Kai Zenner and why you thought that he would be an interesting guest?
Yeah, so Kai is a well-known policy commentator in Brussels. He's been a friend of mine for many years. He's the head of office of MEP Axel Voss, who is a very influential MEP in the parliament, representing the European People's Party, the EPP, which is center-right. Kai is also a policy fellow at the Technical University of Munich, and importantly, he was one of the key people in the background when the AI Act was being negotiated. So he's deep in the weeds of digital policy, and I sat down with Kai to ask him about the EuroStack initiative, which he's a part of, the geopolitical reasons behind it, the state of the transatlantic relationship, and the need for sovereign digital infrastructure, and how the European institutions are prioritizing tech sovereignty. Just to start this discussion, I know this is a long discussion, and I would love to sort of go into the details of this in terms of what we should do next. But I guess my first question is, what do you think is sovereignty? What is, in your mind, does this mean? What should we do as policymakers to put in the guardrails? And how should we incentivize industry, really, to stand on their own feet and improve the economy?
Yeah. First of all, I will go a little bit back because indeed you touched up on it yourself. It's really, for us, it's sometimes difficult to see that it took so long for people to realize what are the problems, what should be done. You have written in your former roles also often about it. We, Axel Voss and I, wrote our digital manifesto in 2019 with a kind of roadmap which I could summarize, Europe, please get your act together on digital. Even in those previous discussions, we had indeed always different camps. Let's say the Breton 1.0 camp, the French, that really wanted to have their own browser, their own WhatsApp, their own cloud, and so on, and kind of competing with Silicon Valley, building up huge companies and so on. I'm saying now Axel and I, but also a lot of other people never fully believed in that because let's take a small analogy, diversity in language. We think makes also a lot of sense when you look to our economy because of our SMEs and so on. So this idea of Gaia X, for example, to have a federated system with a lot of smaller players, but that are interoperable and that are working well together, and therefore also this concept of interoperability in the Data Act, that you can basically switch rather easy, makes in our eyes a lot of sense and would fit very well to our understanding of sovereignty, which is basically that you have an option to choose what you want, to switch, and so on. And combined with that you, of course, you asked that point, that you allow international companies, international partners to still be active here on our internal market, to offer their products, their services, wherever place by our rules is welcome. And if you look, for example, to the 5G discussion, there were people who wanted to kick out a specific Chinese company, which, however, is probably, at least in the short and midterm, not possible. So why not concentrating on certain components of the 5G network, let's say, that are really critical, maybe make them European, or at least use a very, very trustful company. And for the rest, at least again for midterm, continue with what we have now and really just filter out those super critical points. And then in addition, of course, go extremely strategic forward and look where Europe still has a chance. So, for example, the old topics of biotech, of machinery, of drones, robotics, and so on.
You mentioned this EuroStack, the word EuroStack, and I want to sort of delve very deep into that a bit. What is the EuroStack in your mind? And how should we use this idea to get to where we were talking about, in a place where you have more technological sovereignty?
So, to the first point of your question, so far I see the EuroStack movement really as a grassroots movement that is bringing together very different people with very different ideas, very different ideologies or political backgrounds and so on, that are united by this feeling that we became partially, at least, a digital colony, that we are highly dependent in critical areas and so on, and that we need to do something with a clear vision that all of us want to achieve, but it's unclear what we really mean and want to do. And this brings me now to the second part of your question. I'm personally a big fan of at least the idea behind the India stack, but also what our partners in Brazil, for example, are doing. The central bank with their digital currency. Well, there's criticism, but at least the idea is super interesting, and it could really change a lot of things to the better when it's about society, our economy, and so on. So, and Europe, maybe as a last point, Europe is also not at zero. We had this already before. We have a lot of things already in place. We have a lot of best practices, from the typical example of Estonia, Finland, but also Spain and so on, where we could build up on. My vision now from the EuroStack would be indeed exactly that we kind of look what India did, what Brazil did, what a few other countries did, and are using our already existing mechanism like eIDAS 2.0, European electronic ID, maybe the digital euro, maybe the data spaces, Data Governance Act, and so on, which are already partially covering parts of the India stack or parts of the whole EuroStack idea. But the big problem is it's work silos. No? They were not connected. People in the commission, people in the national ministries, but even companies were seeing them as isolated things. How do you identify yourself as a customer was not put together with how do you pay, even though it's kind of logical. And now with It's Me here in Belgium, for example, there are first steps. So I think this would be the easiest thing, the lowest hanging fruit, let's say, in the whole EuroStack debate, to bring it together. And then the big question is, what do we do in addition? And there, if I would be now von der Leyen or Merz in Germany as the new chancellor, I would really try to find out, going back to what we discussed before, where is our biggest potential? Where do we have a chance? Where are certain dependencies that are critical in terms of privacy, in terms of security, in terms of whatsoever? Let's say also climate change or sustainability points and so on. And then really strategically saying, okay, now I make all-in investments, kind of. So make it or break it. Because we cannot continue with what the Commission loves to do, 1 million here, 1 million there. In the end, it's all for nothing. No? It doesn't bring anything. So we really need to focus, and we need to make hard political choices. If it's, for example, in some parts of the stack, even though you and I like diversity also in economy, maybe in some areas it only makes sense to go all in with one player. Then, well, I don't know, there will be a lot of countries that are not happy that, for example, a French or German company will be chosen, but this is then part of a larger, let's say, political deal and political strategy. So in the end, and this brings me to one of the underlying problems that we haven't discussed so far, and that is one of the main reasons, on top of working into silos, that we haven't done anything until now, a lack of political leadership. Because for taking those hard decisions, you need stamina, you need to have what we say is thick skin in Germany, because many, many people will be unhappy about it. Thinking again about my example of picking one company that is now our European champion in a certain area, you will get a lot of pushback. But you, similar to Breton in the last term, I was not always a fan, but he did it in a few situations. You need someone who is standing there and saying, no, this makes sense. This is our rational choice at the moment, so we go for it. Again, hopefully now with all the geopolitical chaos, the perfect storm, we push our decision makers in this direction and forcing them to make those critical decisions. Then I have hope, and then I hope that especially with the EuroStack movement, that we are really focusing on areas where we, as I said, where we have a chance, where we can make it. In other areas, we are trying to reduce our dependencies, especially those that are critical. And on the rest, we are just continuing like we do now, but refocusing on trusted international partners. And I know a lot of US-American companies that could be trusted and should be trusted.
I mean, that's super interesting, because I think at the end of the day, the question is having control of our own destinies, so to speak. I think that's the fundamental concern which is binding us all. And then the question is, what the destiny will look like, and that's where the disagreements come. And I guess then my next sort of, or final question in a sense is this push for deregulation. And now you have, I mean, this is a very blunt way to put it, but you have this push where there's both on both sides of the Atlantic to some extent, where you have governments in power that believe that regulation has gone too far and that we are creating burdens on our economy that are unnecessary. This is not just true with digital, but it's true with the green areas as well. And this is natural because, in my mind, there are pressures for citizens, and these are costs that they have to bear. And so there needs to be, justification that we are putting in a lot of new rules and new sort of burdens. And moving to this idea of sovereignty and moving to this idea of partners, international partners, I've been looking at, who else can the EU partner with? And as part of working at ECDPM, and the previous report was titled From India Stack to EuroStack, but then the idea is to go from there to like a global stack, which would make sense for, promoting European values, but also finding sort of commonalities with other countries. And one approach that sort of I see the Commission especially shifting towards is this idea of having agile governance. And this is a term that is in the Japanese digital laws, where it's one of the key principles, where they want to govern the digital sphere because it's so fast moving, because things change all the time, they have to be responsive, that you need to have instruments or methods of governance, if you will, or frameworks, which are inclusive, which include a lot of stakeholders, which are iterative, where you can go back, there's a lot of communication back and forth, and so on. And I guess being an architect of the AI Act, this was one of the first, let's say, ideas of agile governance in practice, is this code of practice for general purpose AI providers. I guess my question then is, there are two questions. One question is, can we, or is there a trade-off that we need to take care of with deregulation and this agenda for cutting red tape? And what is this trade-off, and what should we really take care of? And I guess the second question is more AI specific, is how is the EU ready or changing itself to adopt these new models of governance that are going to encourage these partnerships? Complicated question.
We are both fighting for 5 years against overregulation, against, in particular, work silos or legislative silos that were, for example, not streamlining the definition of open source. And that despite legal service, despite lawyer linguists, despite so many services being involved, we have now a situation that open source is 2 times differently defined in the AI Act, then a different definition in the PLD, Product Liability Directive, and then in the Cyber Resilience Act. It's really shameful. We, but also the Greens, a few others, Sven Johan from Renew, were constantly pointing on that point, but the majority, and especially the Commission, was not interested in those not really important things. It was all about finishing as soon as possible. Now, the same people, and again, I'm saying that Axel Voss sees it very, very similar than I, the same people that were at fault for this bad governance and for this pressuring of the co-legislators, because both co-legislators didn't want to finalize everything so fast, are now coming up with deregulation, but not really trying to solve all the things that we were criticizing the last 5 years. But now basically deregulation means only simplification in the way that you are just removing here a small part, reducing reporting burdens and so on. This, in our eyes, doesn't have anything to do with deregulation or simplification. It's even making it worse. And again, we cannot understand that now the same people that were creating this regulatory problem are there to solve it. They cannot do it. Our idea would have been the section of the Commission to take care of it, or actually think tanks like you or universities that are sitting together for 6 months, for 1 year, to really go actually with AI through all the laws, and then are really looking at all those points that are flawed, that because of time pressure were not be possible to streamline, where maybe certain content-wise problems of mistakes were produced and so on. But again, unfortunately, this is not being done. There is again a lot of pressure to do fast simplification, which in the end will be just a small presence for certain companies, big companies. Exactly. So on that, we are extremely disappointed. I need to very, very clearly underline here. And well, there's still also here the jury is out. The Commission and also now the co-legislators, of course, can or hopefully will spend more time in it, and maybe then all those omnibus in the packages in the future will maybe also look a bit different. But what we see right now again is not what we and all the stakeholders from Business Europe to civil society have really asked for, because it will not make European law better to understand or easier to get compliant with. Which brings me now, this was very negative, to a more positive point, because indeed the AI Act was, in my opinion, adopted 6 months too early. We should have extended the trialogue. Would never have been a problem. It was being done in 2019 and 2014. Trialogues can be paused and then continued after the election. No one would have died if the AI Act would have been adopted in October or whatsoever. But well, if you look in the AI Act, as you said, there are indeed a lot of new attempts to regulate. And indeed, it was because of many internationally thinking people like Eva Meidel, like my boss, also the Spanish presidency, we were actually actively looking into other areas. Gabriele Mancini, who I think is still in the Commission, one of the authors in the Commission, was also heavily engaging when he was drafting with international partners. He's a very, very smart person, internationally very well connected. And there was then indeed by many of us this attempt to create an untypical European law that is principle-based, something the industry was always asking for, that is adjustable, that is able to be dynamic enough in order to catch up with digital development, AI development, and so on, and indeed also accessible, how we always called it, in meaning that stakeholders, as, for example, part of the scientific panel or now the code of practice with working groups, are basically constantly there and can inform us policymakers or the Commission, the AI office, that probably is not aware of all developments on the market or in the field of AI, of certain new opportunities, of certain new risks. And those risks or opportunities can then be addressed by the AI Act by making adjustments if it needs to go fast via secondary legislation, via codes, via guidelines, or even with delegated acts in the annex, or then with a review. And indeed, we think until today that the AI Act therefore is showing correctly in the future of how new digital laws should look like in the future, especially in the digital field. There should be always this kind of constant exchange with stakeholders, that those stakeholders maybe, it's not in the AI Act, but in the future also have the chance to overrule maybe even the Commission or block certain things, because in the end, again, they know best. They are much closer to what is happening. And this, indeed, I think we learned a lot from South Korea, from Japan, where Singapore, which is famous for this close stakeholder cooperation. And I on that point, I really feel very positive that maybe in 5 to 10 years, many of our digital laws will look very similar, and hopefully then we will have a much smaller number of digital laws that are, however, then constantly being adjusted, updated, and so on, and hopefully not overlapping or contradicting anymore. Because also there, as I said already, I think the EU institutions are not really able to clean it up themselves. It should be probably some outside expertise that is looking into it, some professors or whatsoever, that are then sending their findings to the EU institutions, and we are basically following up on that.
So in your interview, you did start to discuss a little bit the importance of international partnerships and of a EuroStack that is open to the world. But a lot of the discussions in Brussels have tended to be somewhat insular and not to really consider holistically the importance of partnerships. With a EU international digital strategy coming up, I think this is a particularly relevant moment to discuss this. How do you think that the EU can navigate strategic interdependencies across the tech stack?
It's a great question. It's $1 million question that everyone's preoccupied with in Brussels, and I think Kai's interview was quite insightful in the sense, because it sort of illustrated the divide that exists at the moment. On the one hand, you have a camp that really wants to focus on European solutions, European companies, European innovation, and then on the other, you have the recognition that Europe cannot provide for all of its needs, the recognition that Europe's strengths are actually in being open, in being a trading bloc, historically being able to drive consensus. And I think those are the characteristics that Europe should double down on and then focus on. And so Kai's views, I think, were quite interesting, because it sort of illustrated this catch-22 situation that Europe is in. On the one hand, we want technological sovereignty, we want to have control of our own destinies online, but on the other, we need to have the tech capabilities, both on the side of companies and European startups that are making innovation happen, but also the talent and the skills. The skills question remains extremely live in Europe. And for example, according to the digital decade targets, we need about 10 or 20 million ICT workers by the end of 2030. And we're currently at the most generous estimate around 4 million in Europe. And I think that's a problem. But there are solutions overseas. India, for example, has a vast pool of ICT workers. And I think this could be a game changer for Europe if we're able to figure out how to create mobility, how to create the right conditions to ensure that we have a more open and a more sort of beneficial discussion.
Yeah, well, that's really what we've been trying to do with our work recently, to look a little bit also at how the EU can work with other players around the world, including maybe with Brazil, looking at new green technologies and new use cases for digital technologies, looking at EU-Africa cooperation in the area of AI, for example, looking at how the EU can engage India on the skills question, but also on numerous other parts of the tech stack, from chips through
6G research.
6G.
So there's so many areas of finding sort of mutual interests and to try to create initiatives that benefit both sides. I think fundamentally Europe is at a moment where the reflection needs to go deeper than which kinds of files we should deal with, which kinds of countries. I think it should go beyond that to a point of sort of mutual respect and mutual understanding. And I think that was probably one of the fundamental objectives of our report, which was to try to put India and Europe at an even keel and say, what can we learn as Europeans from the Indian initiatives, and how can we contribute to Indian interests and in Indian needs, and vice versa. And I think this is really the core difference, if you will, of how Europe should show up in the world. We should be much more open-minded and much less about trying to put the Brussels effect all over the place, and much more rather look inwards and see what we can learn and how we can get better, given the new world we're in.
We've been doing a lot of work in Africa, in various different countries, and attending a lot of events. And there is a growing sense of fatigue, I would say, around the Brussels effect, and a growing desire to really see the EU actually step up in terms of some of the promises it has made. Notably, we've worked a lot at ECDPM on the Global Gateway Initiative, which promises 300 billion in infrastructure investment by 2027. And while there have been a lot of announcements, what we're hearing in a lot of partner countries is that the actual investments are very slow to materialize, and they're not really seeing the uptick in private sector investment that the EU has promised. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and we will be doing a lot more on all of these topics in the coming months. Thank you for joining today, and we hope you'll continue to listen to our podcast.
Thank you. Take care.